Struggled a little bit this week about what to talk about. I was convicted. We had an elders meeting Monday, and I was kind of convicted about a topic that we talked about that seemed like we need to talk about, and I'll touch on it briefly at the end. And I thought that's where I was going to go, and then Sue and I are spending some time up at the lake at Scott City, and in my quiet time and reading, God sort of changed my mind, so hopefully this will be good for us. I've just selected just one verse this week. Again, this is a little bit different from what I have grown accustomed to relative to giving messages, in that normally Nathan and I do series, right? Where we can pick a section of scripture or a topic or whatever and spend a while developing it and opening it up and digesting it. What I'm doing today is what we call a one-off. All right? So in a one-off, you can't get as deep into the subject, you can't share quite as much, and so on. And clearly the verse that I've picked is one that deserves a series all by itself, and maybe someday we'll go back and do that, but we're going to talk about it today anyway, from Galatians chapter 5, verses 22 and 23. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such things there is no law. That particular verse, to share just a little bit about the verse, Paul is writing to the church in Galatia, and he had been away from them. He had started the church, loved them dearly. They were growing and doing a lot of good things. Paul was now away in the mission field again and was writing back to them because they were struggling some as they grew and as they began to mature, and as they were going on, there were people that were coming in with ideas and concepts and teachings that weren't exactly what Paul had in mind for the church, or more importantly, what the Holy Spirit had in mind for the church. And so the Galatians were struggling a little bit, and Paul writes a letter to help them kind of sort it out. Now, the biggest issue that they were having was a struggle with legalism, right? None of us have a problem with legalism, I'm sure, but this church did. In that they were trying to figure out what bunch of rules they needed to follow in order to be holy, in order to be people of God. And so Paul is trying to help them understand legalism is not the way to holiness. All right? And in fact, he talks a lot about that. And in the beginning of chapter 5 is, in fact, freedom in Christ. Freedom to choose. So I love the fact that Paul is writing to the church he loves. He's writing to the church in a way that is encouraging and teaching. And I kind of smile and contrast that with the letters, for example, that John wrote to the churches in Revelation, where it was more, hey guys, you're screwing this up, right? You better get this right or you're going to be in trouble, kind of thing. Paul's letter is entirely different, and I appreciate that. I love that. That's the way I feel about the church. This particular verse is one that's been very meaningful to me for a very, very long time. And it's one that I've thought about, I've prayed about, but a little backstory. Some of you probably know already. I'm sure I've shared the story before. I relate in many ways to Timothy because my grandmother, Florence Black, and my mother, Raylene Borthwick, are two ladies that prayed for me forever, right? Like Timothy, they are people that were most instrumental in leading me in my spiritual life. This particular verse, I can remember a time my mother, dearly departed 44 years ago, died of cancer. She had a session shortly after I got out of school, fought it for 3 or 4 years, thought we had it under control. 5 years later, she had a relapse, and ultimately, that's what took her to her reward in heaven, was this cancer. But I remember very specifically where this verse comes in. Mom was in the hospital getting some treatment. Grandma was there, and it was just the three of us, Mom in the bed and Grandma and I. And we were talking and sharing a little bit, and Grandma got ready to leave, and she wanted to pray for Mom, and Mom said, yeah. And so Grandma prayed for Mom's healing. And beautiful prayer, worthy prayer, absolutely nothing inappropriate about it at all. And then she gave Mom kind of a hug and a kiss and took off. And it occurred to me after Grandma left the room, it was just Mom and I looked over at my mother and I said, it just occurred to me, Mom, and all the time you've been battling sickness and illness and this cancer, I never once remember hearing you pray about getting well. And she kind of smiled like the wise motherly types can, and she looks at me and she said, no, I never have. And I said, well, why not? And she just kind of smiled again, and she says, when I pray for fruits of the Spirit. And if I have the fruits of the Spirit, the rest of it will work itself out. That was profound to me, particularly in that situation, that verse was so important, and her understanding of that verse so far exceeded anything I'd ever given it credit for, that it really made a difference. So what I'd like for us to do today is take a look at those. Now, one of the first things, and it takes a while to chew on this, and like I say, maybe someday we'll come back and do a full series, because boy, it deserves it, for sure. Fruits of the Spirit. Now, think about just that much. Fruits, right? Fruits are not something that you expect right from the beginning. If you plant a crop or whatever, fruit is not what you're going to get to begin with, right? It's going to take a while. It's going to take a season of growth. It's going to take a season of care. It's going to take a season at least. In fact, Sue and I were looking yesterday. There was a walnut tree right outside of where we have the camper park. And as we were sitting there enjoying the beautiful weather and the beautiful day, the golden leaves were coming down. It almost looked like golden snow, only it was warm. And this walnut tree was dropping walnuts off of the tree. So we began to talk about it. If we gathered up some of those seeds, we're going to try to plant some at home. And according to Wikipedia, which almost never lies to you intentionally, we all know that, okay, it'll take 10 years before that walnut tree is going to give us walnuts at home. 10 years. Wow. Okay, talk about waiting for fruit, but we're going to do it anyway. But this idea of fruit, and it makes me understand when it comes to my relationship with God and what He wants me to be, it's not something immediate, right? It's not this revelation, the flash of light, any of that. Even Paul, when he got struck dead or struck blind in the road, he was 3 days trying to get his head right, but then it was a progression for him to get his service right. So this idea about being fruit means it's going to take a while. There is a process. There is a maturing. There is an expanding, a growing in order to get here. Now, as we begin to look at what the fruits are, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. So if we look at those a little bit then, those are descriptive terms of what God and the Holy Spirit can turn us into as people. Now, this idea of love, and I couldn't help but think about the newborn baby. Some of you actually got to see newborn pictures this morning, I think. Jeannie did anyway, I'm pretty sure of that. Okay, Sue has some. But if you think about a newborn baby, and you think about this idea of love, immediately you fall in love. Now, I got to admit, Prescott was the prettiest baby I have ever seen. I mean, he wasn't pink, he wasn't wrinkled, any of those, kind of things that babies often are. He was really cute, okay? And immediately, one of the things that's always been interesting to me, at least till I was a father, is after all the discomfort, carrying that baby 9 months and going through delivery, all the pain, all the discomfort that you ladies have felt, and then immediately you're in love with that baby when it was a problem for you all that time. In fact, I can remember when our daughter Amy was born, Paulette had a very, very difficult labor. Amy's head was turned wrong and she just couldn't get started down the birth canal and so on. I won't bore you with all the details, but it took quite a while and finally everything worked out fine and she was a very happy, healthy, normal baby. Delivery was great. So we're in the delivery room, the nurse cleans the baby up, wraps her up in the swaddling clothes, brings her over to Paulette, who's still on the table, and she looks at, Paulette looks at her and she says, "Give her to her dad, she hurt me." Okay, so Dad took her, and we counted fingers and toes and we did all the right stuff, and then the nurse and I took her down to the nursery. Well, when I came back, they were just getting ready to move Paulette into the recovery area from the delivery room, and she's just crying her eyes out. I said, "Honey, what's the matter?" She says, "Oh," I said, "awful thanks to Amy. She's never going to forgive me." It's like, honey, she can't understand words. It's fine. You were stressed. You're tired. We were in delivery for 24 hours, for crying out loud. It'll be okay. It'll be okay. But this idea of being in love immediately, right? That's the way God looks at us. He's in love with us immediately. But it seems to me that within us, it's like we're born, like that baby, we're born with the seed of love. But it takes somebody else sharing love, showing us love, encouraging us in a loving way for it to be able to sprout and grow. All right? It's there, but it takes something more. It takes God's touch, and then we, in turn, share the excess of that love with somebody else. All right? It's not something that's just going to happen all by itself. If I throw a grain of wheat out there in the dirt and pour some water on it and come back next spring, there'll be something trying to stay. Love's not like that, right? So we need to look at love in that way. And then this idea of joy, okay? Too often, particularly in today's world, we confuse joy and happiness, and they couldn't be farther apart, right? Not necessarily. And I want to, as I was thinking about this, I couldn't help but think about a time some years ago, before God called me to pastor the church. I was serving as an elder in another church in Colorado, and we had a couple there that had an exceptional gift of hospitality. If somebody new showed up in church more than once or twice, you were invited to their house for a meal, and they got to know you, and it was a wonderful thing. But there was kind of a caveat in that the gentleman involved, he was, part of what he was doing, he was exercising his gift of hospitality, but he was also sizing you up because he was not in elder leadership of the church, and he judged us in his own mind, those of us who were. And so what he was doing by inviting you over, he wanted to know what was important to you, what you thought, and so every once in a while, we would get a letter, we, the elders of the church, would get a letter from a committee who was concerned about something we were either doing or not doing, right? You can all kind of... So anyway, we get one of these letters, and of course, he was the chairman of the committee, right? And so immediately, it was interesting to me because as I had come back on the elder board, I actually did a mini Moses imitation. You know what that is? That's when you negotiate with God, when he tells you to do something and you want to argue with him a little. Well, I'd done some of that because I tried to tell God, look, I was on the elder board for a long time. Now then I'm doing this and I'm doing this and I'm doing that and there's over there. What can I do on the elder board that I'm not already doing? And he told me, you're going to be a peacemaker. Oh, okay. So I'm back on the board. We get this letter, and immediately as we read the letter in an elders meeting, I was thinking about this gentleman and thinking about what was going on. So I told the elders, I said, look, I'm going to set up a meeting with this gentleman, and we're going to talk. And so as soon as I get this set up, I'm going to let all of you know, and I need you praying for me. I need you. God told me I'm to be a peacemaker, and I need you to be praying that I can do that when I meet with this gentleman. They said, yes, we'll do that for you. So I set up the appointment. We actually met for breakfast at a local cafe there in the community. We got together. It was about 9, little after, to meet for breakfast. We sat down. We go through a lot of cordialities. How's the family? The weather's been nice. You know, the small talk kind of stuff. And finally, he kind of does one of these numbers, and he looks at me and he says, well, I suppose you want to talk about the letter. And I said, no, not really. I said, we got it and we read it, but that's not why I wanted to take you to... He says, well, then why am I here? So I looked at him and I said, you know, I know that you're a very mature Christian. You take being a Christian very seriously. You take your faith very seriously. But when I look at you, I don't see any joy in your life. Help me see what I'm missing. Where is the joy? And he just went off, right? And it's like 4th of July. I'm sitting there watching all, and well, I mean, it was, right? I just tried not to get any of it on me, that's all. And so he let all this emotion out and all this stuff. And so I would sit there and I'd listen and I did an input. And so then when the energy was down, I'd come back and I said, but where's the joy? Where's the joy in your life? And so it would go again, and not quite as much energy that time. That breakfast lasted 2.5 hours. They were actually serving lunch by the time we left. Okay? And so following Sunday in church, by the way, he never did get around to explaining the joy part. You know, I'm sure he was just so tired by the time we got through. But looking for joy is important. And those of us that are mature in our faith, mature in our walk, the thing that will attract other people who need to know God is how can you have that joy? How can you have that attitude with everything that's going on around you? My mom was joyful that day in the hospital, right? So this idea of joy is different. But it's important that we learn how to be joyful. After all, God's the one that's in control, not me, not us. And then this idea of peace. Now, it occurs to me in all the turmoil, you know, I'm sure every generation has probably said this, but boy, what a mess we've made out of our society lately. We're just always angry and we're always divided and we're always, you know, and it's like, seriously, folks. And I think what people are looking for is that peace. You know, that thing that gives them rest, that thing that gives them comfort, that thing where they just know it's going to work out to be okay. And people can't find that anymore. And part of the problem, the biggest part of the problem, they're looking in the wrong place, right? Because we're not going to get that by being married to the right person or having the right job or having the right balance in your checking account or living in the right house or whatever it is. That's not where the peace comes from. The peace comes from a relationship with God. And again, a story about myself. And by the way, I'm not trying to draw attention to myself, but I'm the only one that's given me permission to share things, right? And unless you tell me, unless I come to you and say, hey, I'd like to tell about this part of your story, is that okay? I'm not going to do it, right? And I have asked on occasion with some people, but this idea about peace, I can remember when Scott was so critically injured many years ago, and we're spending the first night in ICU, and he's hooked up to all these machines, and they're doing all these tests, and we don't know from hour to hour whether they're going to have to put in a trach tube, and I mean, this is really serious. And I was talking to God, and that's when he talked to me, and he said, Larry, I'm the healer. What do you know, you're worried about the machines and the doctor. I'm the great healer. I've got this. And 3 times that night in the hospital, I remember God telling me, Larry, do you trust me? And as soon as I finally figured out, yeah, I do, okay, then that sense of peace, and then he's like, okay, now that you're here, we've got some things you're going to need to do. All right, we spent 19 days in intensive care getting him healthy enough to move him out. But the amount of peace that he gave us in that situation was just amazing. And I remember the day we finally got to move Scott out of intensive care and into a regular room for a little while we moved it. The head charge nurse who had been there that whole 19 days, she just come over and she said, Larry, we've never had a family like you guys up here before. It was just amazing the difference having you around made for everybody else. And that peace can only come from a mature relationship with God, knowing that he was going to take care of it. It was going to be okay, right? That's not something you get the day you come up out of the baptism, right? You just don't understand that yet. And then this idea about patience. And patience is interesting. Many years ago, I served under a pastor in Colorado who used to joke his most often asked prayer for himself personally is, Lord, please give me patience and give it to me right now. And that's kind of how sometimes we want to, this idea of patience takes a while to develop, right? And the thing about patience, it always involves some other interceding action. Sometimes it's an action we're waiting on for God. Sometimes it's an action we're waiting on from somebody, some other person, right? It took a while for Sue to realize she was falling in love with me. She didn't really want to. She had a perfectly good life the way it was. So I had to be patient while she figured it out, right? And I just kind of kept hanging in there. And is that fair? Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay? So this idea of patience, and I will tell another story on myself. For about 1.5 years or 2 years before God called to come out here and love the church, in daily devotions, we kept getting this message, get ready, get ready. And we kept praying about, okay, help me be ready, help us get ready. And finally, a little bit at a time, kind of like watching the sun come up, a little more light, finally it came to light that we were going to come here and work in the church. And kind of misunderstood at first, but that's all right. So this idea of patience, we got a little ahead of God, and there was actually a point of time during the summer. I actually came here 12 years ago this month, right? Probably this Sunday now that I think about it. But anyway, we knew in the spring God wanted us to come out here and become a part of the church. So we actually took some time off and we came out here and looked for a house, right? And God said, "What are you doing? Get back out there. I'll let you know when it's the right time." So we had to be patient, even though we understood somehow or other. And then finally we got a call. I thought, and so did Paulette, when we first got the call, thought we were coming out here. We thought we were coming to help the church, right? The pastor was a little burned out and kind of struggling a little and so on. So I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to go out there and be his Barnabas, kind of like what we're doing there in Colorado. And we get a call from Grandma Helen one morning, and she says, "Hey, the pastor resigned today. He's moving back east." Whoa, you know. But this idea about being patient, waiting on God, waiting on the right time, and that patience always involves somebody else. And the closer, the more we care, the harder the patience is, right? Those of you who have raised prodigal children, patience is hard, right? Patience is hard, but we need it. And so if we ask God for it appropriately, we'll get it. And then this idea of kindness, we all know what kindness is about. But again, kindness is sharing with somebody else. In order to be recognized or in order to have kindness, right, there's got to be somebody else in the loop. All by myself, I can't do that. So there again, that's a gift of God. That's an example of how we need to be to help somebody else and to be there. Now, one of the things that we need to be careful about when it comes to kindness, we want to be kind to people, all right, but we don't necessarily want to be enabling either, right? And it's easy to get the two mixed up. So it's easy to say, well, you know, I really wish you weren't doing that, but I'm going to let you. I'm going to tolerate it. And maybe that's the best you can do is tolerate it for a while, but the kindness says you really offer a better way. Kindness, you try to get them involved in a better way, and you don't just enable. And then this idea of goodness, you know, we all kind of know what that looks like, but it changes a lot. Good in one situation might not be, but goodness is just doing the next right thing. Just the next right thing, right? We talk to grandkids about that all the time. Just do the next right thing. I don't know where you're going. I don't know what's going to happen. You've got all these wonderful plans, but they're going to change. They're going to, you know, just do the next thing right. You know what the next thing needs to be. Just do it the right way. And so this idea of goodness, just do the next right thing. And then faithfulness. Faithfulness, another one that takes a while to get. Faithfulness, again, is not something you can keep all by yourself. None of these things really are. But faithfulness means there's somebody else that you're in relationship with. Hopefully with God. Hopefully with spouse or loved ones or children. And faithfulness says, no matter what's going on, I'm going to take care of that relationship. I'm going to care. I'm going to do the next right thing, that goodness thing. Now, a very poor example of that, I just explained as I got started talking, I'd loaned Sue out for 3 weeks. When she got back, not only were all the dishes clean, they were put away. The cat box was empty and the floors were clean. Now, 3 days before she got back, that wasn't necessarily true, okay? But I know that's something that's important to her. Clearly, the dishwasher being run and the cat box being clean are things that are much more important to her than they are to me personally. All right? But because I wanted to be faithful to her and to our relationship, and to show her how much I appreciate, that's something that it was important for me to have that done before she got there. So this idea about faithfulness says there are things that I am going to put aside what I want to do what I know is right for somebody else. That takes a while to mature into that kind of a relationship. And in fact, if more marriages had that kind of an attitude, we'd have less divorce, right? Because we struggle with that idea about faithfulness in marriage because I'm thinking Sue ought to do all this stuff for me, and if she doesn't, well then, we'll have trouble, right? But that's not what faithfulness has. And that faithfulness to God as well. There are times God puts me in situations I really would not have volunteered for that one, right? But if that's what he needs, I'm going to be faithful, and I'm going to say, okay, what do you want me to do? How do you want me to act? Who do you want me to talk to? What do you want me to say? All right? I'm going to be faithful to his call, and I'm going to get through that. And then gentleness, and here again, sometime, and I think, as I explained in Galatians, when Paul wrote this letter, they were struggling with this idea of legalism. And so Paul, in his letter, is gentle with them and trying to get them back where they needed to be and help them think about things in the right kind of way. And he didn't do it in a critical or demeaning sort of way. He just kind of helped steer them back where they belong. All right? Now, an analogy that some of you may relate to is if you've ever handled stock, cows, sheep, cows particularly, all right, there's two ways of doing it. You can force them, right? You can yell and scream and use whips and hot shots and all kinds of, and you can eventually get it done, maybe. And you just hope nobody gets hurt, right? Cows or people, because I've seen both happen, sometimes on the same day, in the same group. Or you can take the gentleness approach. And I got to admit, when I'm working cattle, I much prefer the cattle have been raised or cared for by a lady instead of a guy, because they'll do this better. This gentleness, we just take our time, let them find the hole. They'll know where to go, all right? And if we get the right mama cow to go, the rest of them are going to follow in, and we don't have to we can just take our time. Nobody gets excited. Nobody gets hurt. Right? All we've got to do is be gentle. And the same thing is true with most any animal will respond to that gentleness, and so will the people around us, right? Even if they're doing the wrong thing, even if they haven't found the place to go, be gentle, right? Don't be critical, don't be judgmental. And then finally, in this idea of fruits of the Spirit, self-control. And that's one, we're going to struggle with that forever, this idea of self-control. Now, there are certain things we can do pretty easy, right? I can decide through my self-control, I'm going to shower at least every other day. More often than that, if I've been outside working and so on. Self-control says I'm going to be pretty good about getting up and going to work when they expect me to, right? Or things like that. But self-control in some other areas means that I'm going to pay attention to the other 8 things on this list when I'm with somebody else, and I'm going to keep my tongue under control. I'm going to keep my temper under control. I'm going to handle people and handle my relationship with God in the right kind of way. All right? I'm going to be mature about this, and I'm not going to be argumentative about this. One of the things, particularly for us guys, but I suspect it's true in a different sort of way with you ladies, one of the things about being a guy, ever since we were about late elementary school on, we learn how to compete, right? We play games, we compete in school, we compete in games. Later on, we compete for our spouse, right? We compete for jobs, we compete for pay raises. And this idea of self-control says, I got to give up the competition. I don't want to be in competition with you. I want to be in partnership with you. All right? I want to walk along beside you. I want the two of us to become Barnabases to each other instead of this idea of competition. All right? And that idea of competition is what got the Galatians confused in the first place, because the people that were coming in and preaching the legalism to them were people who thought, if I follow this rule and you don't, I'm better than you. Right? And let's face it, originally God only gave us one rule, right? Don't eat off of that particular tree. Well, we couldn't get that one right. So some years later, he gave us 10, right? And we struggled with the 10, but all the rest of the rules were written by men, right? Now, if we thought of them instead of law, like the Old Testament, we need to think about them as guidelines, right? They kind of help me get an idea of where to go. But this idea of self-control is where I can put that back into perspective, right? I can help with that. So to kind of sum up here, this fruits of the Spirit for me personally has been very important. And it's a measure of where I am in my maturity, in my relationship, not only with God, but with the people God's given me to love. You guys, right? So this idea, and when I am confused, when I'm tired, when I'm whatever, and I know I'm not being the way God needs me to be, I'll go down through the list and say, what am I missing here? What have I let get away from me? All right? And I will go through these and look. And I think when I see, when new people come into my life or into the church, one of the things I will admit doing, and I'm only going to admit this once, I do an inventory when we meet, right? As I get to know you, and I give you grades, so to speak, here to see where I think you are on the maturity scale, all right? And I'm not doing it so that I can put you in a pocket or whatever. I'm doing it so I can have a better understanding of how I can help you with the others, you know, with the ones that you need some help with. And to be honest with you, most of you wouldn't fit in the pocket in the first place, and most of you that are here today are doing real good with this. We'd all pass, right? So this idea, think about this idea of maturity. And it was interesting that this idea of fruits of the Spirit came at a time in our community when fruits are being gathered. You know, this is fall harvest. This is the last cutting of crops for the year. It's a time when we should be celebrating. It's time for rejoicing. So think about periodically where you are with the fruits of the Spirit and where they may be able to help you. Now, just briefly, I want to go to a different verse, an entirely different subject. I've never given 2 sermons in the same message before, but we're going to try it today. From Proverbs, chapter 3, verse 9, honor the Lord with your wealth and with the first fruits of all your produce. Now is the time when we are harvesting and produce is available, at least the kinds of stuff that's going on here. And one of the things particularly, I want you to be thinking about this in relation to next week's congregational meeting. We need you to come. We need you to be here. We need you to learn about the ministries that the church is undergoing here. Originally, I thought I was supposed to teach or have a message about tithing, and I'm not going to do that, okay, as much as I'd like to. I remember when I first came here and I talked to the church board, I made it very clear to them, if you decide to call me as a pastor, I want nothing to do with counting the offering or talking about, because I don't want to see who's giving. I don't want to see how much they're giving. I don't want to help put it in the bank. I want nothing to do with any of that. I will, I promise, give you lots of places where I think we ought to spend your money, but I don't want to know who's giving, because I don't want the temptation of loving some of you more than others. And if I don't know, then that's pretty easy. I can stay away from that, right? But this idea of first fruits, all right? First fruits are mentioned several times in the Bible, and in fact, we may come back and do a series on them one of these days too. First fruits, I'm a first fruit. I am the eldest son in my family, all right? So in the Old Testament times, that meant I would have been dedicated differently than my brothers and committed differently to service to God in the temple than others. First fruits also means when you get new land or new property or whatever, you give a bigger share to God because of that. Now, in the old days, they used to, their celebrations, you would bring your first fruits in, and those first fruits, and basically your tithes and offerings, supplied the church and the needs of the church. All right? For the priests, for the Levites, for the people that worked there. We've read in the Old Testament about there were times they needed construction money, right? They'd let the place run down. They needed to fix it up, so people would bring money. So tithing is important. And this idea of tithing, it's interesting. If you look up tithe in the Old Testament, and in your dictionaries, they're going to talk to you about how Abraham set the example by tithing to Melchizedek. But what they don't tell you, unless you read on down in there, this idea of giving 10% to people in authority, that was a custom through all world at that time, not just to Abraham. But it was important that people understood when somebody else is in authority, we need to